The morning Clement Keller rode into Harlan Flats with a letter folded against his chest and dust on his boots thick enough to plant seeds in. He told himself, it was just a job: deliver the notice, collect the signature, ride back before sundown. But that was before he saw Evelyn Brooks standing at the edge of her dying cornfield with a hoe in her hands and fire in her eyes, staring down a sky that had not given one drop of rain in 11 weeks. The year was 1884, and the drought that had crept across the Kansas plains that summer was the kind that broke men and buried homesteads under silence. The land south of Dodge City had turned itself into cracked clay and powder, rivers pulling back to their muddy bones, wells going dry so fast that families packed their wagons at midnight and were gone before anyone could say goodbye. The government office in Dodge had been logging abandoned claims for 3 months straight, and Clement, who worked as a field agent for the Homestead Land Office, had ridden these roads so many times with bad news in his saddlebag that he had stopped feeling the weight of it, or so he believed. He had turned 28 that April, and there was something in his face that spoke of weather and hard years, not old, but seasoned in the way that the plains seasoned a man whether he wanted it or not. He was broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck when the humidity rose, and eyes the color of weathered cedar, somewhere between green and brown depending on what the sky was doing. He was not the kind of man who talked much, which had made him good at his job for the past 4 years, because a man who talked too much delivered bad news and made it worse with explanations, while a man who talked carefully could sometimes soften the blow without lying. Evelyn Brooks, on the other hand, was exactly the kind of woman who talked, not out of nervousness or frivolity, but because she believed that silence left too much room for assumptions, and she had learned a long time ago that assumptions were how women like her lost things. She had turned 25 the previous February, and she had been working the claim alone since March, when a fever had taken her husband, Thomas Brooks, in the span of 5 terrible days. Thomas had been 27. He had been kind and capable, and had loved this land with the particular devotion of a man who had never owned anything before, and when he died, Evelyn had made a decision so quietly that she had not even announced it aloud to herself. She would stay. She would work the claim. She would not be moved. The claim was 160 acres of Kansas prairie that Thomas had filed under the Homestead Act 2 years before, in 1882. They had built a soddy together, a house with walls cut from the earth itself, cool in summer and tolerably warm in winter, 3 rooms that Evelyn had made into a home with salvaged curtains, and a cast-iron stove she had brought all the way from Missouri in the back of a wagon. She had a kitchen garden behind the house, a small orchard of struggling apple trees, a milk cow named Hazel, 2 draft horses, and a cornfield that in a better year might have yielded enough to carry her through winter and into the next planting season. But 1884 was not a better year. The sky had shut itself off like a turned faucet, and the corn she had planted in May was tall enough to hope for but not strong enough to survive, and she knew it. She knew it when she walked the rows each morning and felt the brittle edges of the leaves, when she watched the soil pull apart in long, pale cracks that widened every day like wounds healing in the wrong direction. She knew it, and she stayed anyway, because where else was there to go? Clement saw her from the road, at first just a shape in the field, and then, as he slowed his horse, a dun gelding named Powder, to a walk, he made out the detail of her. A woman in a faded blue dress with her hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, working a hoe between rows of corn that were visibly struggling, her movements neither hurried nor defeated but something in between, something determined. He stopped at the edge of her property line, where a modest fence post still stood with a strip of rusted wire running off in both directions, and he cleared his throat. She did not look up immediately. She finished the row she was on, turned at the end, and walked toward him with the hoe resting over her shoulder like a rifle. When she was close enough that he could see the fine lines of dust on her cheeks and the steadiness of her brown eyes, she stopped and looked at him the way a woman who has been bothered by too many men with too many problems learns to look, not hostile exactly, but prepared. "Can I help you?" she said. "I am looking for Mrs. Evelyn Brooks," he said. "Owner of the Brooks claim, Section 14, Harlan Flats Township." "You found her," she said. "Who are you?" "Clement Keller. I work for the land office in Dodge City." He reached into the saddlebag and drew out the letter, folded into thirds and sealed with the official mark. He held it out to her. "I have a notice for you." She did not take it immediately. She looked at his hand, then at his face, with that measuring gaze that made him feel as though she were reading something written in small print on his forehead. "What kind of notice?" she asked. He was not a man who softened things as a rule. He had found over 4 years that soft delivery did not change the content, and usually felt dishonest. But something about the way she was standing upright, composed, her hand on that hoe, the dying field behind her, and the kind of quietness around her eyes that spoke of a person who had already survived something terrible, made him want to be careful. "The land office has determined that your claim is at risk of abandonment under the terms of the Homestead Act," he said. "The drought conditions have been assessed, and a number of properties in this area that cannot demonstrate active cultivation and development have been flagged for potential forfeiture. You are on that list." She said nothing for a moment. The wind moved through the dead dry corn with a sound like paper tearing. "Active cultivation," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "I am standing in my field with a hoe in my hand," she said. "I have been here since before sunup. My cow is milked, my horses are watered from a barrel I haul from the creek 3 miles east, and those corn rows were measured and tended this morning. Tell me how that is not active cultivation." "The assessment is based on the condition of the crop and the likelihood of any yield," he said. "The drought has compromised. I am aware of what the drought has compromised," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that was more unsettling than anger would have been. "I live here. I have watched it happen. But the act says I must cultivate, not that I must succeed. Show me where it says I must make rain." He sat on his horse for a moment, the letter still extended between them, and he felt something shift in his chest in a way that he did not immediately have a name for. She was right. She was legally, precisely right. The Homestead Act required cultivation and improvement. It did not require a specific yield, and it certainly did not account for acts of weather. The drought notices he had been delivering were technically advisory in nature, warnings of potential risk, not orders of removal, and the land office's position was that agents used their discretion in the field. He had been delivering them as if they were death sentences because that was what they had felt like, because most of the people he had delivered them to had already given up and signed the release papers, and the notice had only been a formality. Evelyn Brooks was not most people. He lowered the letter. "You have a point," he said. She looked at him as though she had expected an argument and was recalibrating for a concession. "I do know that," she said, slightly less sharply. "The notice is advisory," he said. "It is not a removal order. You do not have to sign anything today." "I was not planning to sign anything," she said. He almost smiled. He caught it and put it down. "You will need to demonstrate continued improvement to avoid further action," he said. "That means getting through the summer with something still standing on this land. That is what I intend to do." "The creek 3 miles east," he said. "How long has it been reduced?" 6 weeks since it dropped to what it is now. Before that it was running slow for a month." "Your well?" "Dry since June." He looked past her at the field, at the horses in the small corral, at the neat sod house with its 2 windows and the kitchen garden visible around the side. He looked at the apple trees, 6 of them, small and stressed but not dead, their leaves curled at the edges but still green at the center. "Your trees are surviving," he said. She glanced back at them. "I give them water first, the animals and the trees first, then the garden, then myself. And the corn," there was a pause, "the corn gets what is left. Something in that sentence landed in him like a stone into still water, sending circles out that he did not yet understand. She had organized her survival into a hierarchy and had placed herself at the bottom of it, not out of self-sacrifice for any theatrical reason, but out of pure, clear-eyed practicality, because she understood that the trees and the animals were the long investment, and a woman could go thirsty longer than a tree could. He refolded the letter and put it back in his saddlebag. I will note in my report that the Brooks claim shows active cultivation and continued improvement, he said. The advisory will be logged as delivered. The rest is between you and the land office, and you have time. She studied him. Why? Because you are right, he said, and because I have been delivering these notices to people who had already quit, and it is the first time in a while I have delivered one to someone who has not. She looked at him for a long moment, and the measuring quality in her eyes shifted to something more like consideration, and then to something more like gratitude, though she wore it in a practical way, the way a person accepts what they need without making a fuss. I have water in the house, she said, and the horses, if your animal needs it. It was not exactly an invitation, but it was close enough. That is kind, he said. He dismounted. That was how it started, not with a grand gesture or a spoken declaration, but with a woman offering water to a horse in the middle of a drought, and a man accepting, and both of them standing in the dry afternoon light with something unspoken beginning to take shape between them. Evelyn led Powder to the water trough behind the house, the trough half full from the last haul she had made from the creek. The dun gelding drank with the focused gratitude that horses bring to everything, and Clement stood holding the reins and looking at the lay of the land while Evelyn filled a tin cup with water from the barrel just inside the kitchen door and brought it to him without asking whether he wanted it. You are a long way from town, he said, accepting the cup. 160 acres tends to be, she said. He drank. The water was cool and tasted of iron, the way barrel water did. How long have you been managing alone? She did not flinch at the question, but he saw her adjust to it, the way a person shifts their weight to a stronger foot. Since March, my husband Thomas passed. Fever. I am sorry, he said, and he meant it without embellishment, the way a man who has seen a lot of loss means it. So am I, she said, but sorry does not water the trees. He handed back the cup. She took it, and their fingers did not quite touch, and neither of them made anything of it. I noticed your furrows run east to west, he said. She looked at him. Yes. If you reorient them north to south, even partially, you will catch more of the morning shadow along the soil line. Slows evaporation. Old dry farming technique, better suited to a drought year. The Mennonite farmers west of Dodge started doing it when the rains turned sparse in the 70s. She was quiet for a moment. I had not heard that. Most people have not. It is not common knowledge in the land office literature. She looked at the field for a long moment, calculating in the way she did most things, with a focused, inward attention that turned her face serious and still. It would be a lot of reworking. It would, he admitted, but it might save part of the stand. She looked at him again, and there was something different in her expression now, not softened exactly, because Evelyn Brooks did not soften easily, but opened, a fraction, the way a door opens just wide enough to let in a different quality of light. You know more about farming than a land agent generally would, she said. I grew up on a farm, he said. Nebraska, before the family lost it. He said the last part without self-pity, just as a fact. Lost it how? Drought, he said. She almost laughed. He saw it move through her face, the brief involuntary recognition of a very dark irony, and then it settled into something quieter, and she shook her head. And now you ride out to tell other people their land is failing, she said. I did not say failing, he said. I said advisory. That is a kind distinction. I am trying, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than she had been allowing herself to look at him. He was a steady kind of man. She could see that, not flashy, not performing, just present in the way that some men were present, as though their occupation of space was effortless and natural. He had calluses on his hands and a line of sun-darkened skin across the back of his neck, and he looked at the land the way farmers looked at it, not as scenery but as argument. I should get back to the rows, she said. I want to finish before the heat peaks. I will not keep you, he said. He went to Powder and gathered the reins, and he had swung himself up into the saddle before he thought of anything more to say. And by the time he thought of it, she had already walked back into the field and was hoeing between the rows again with that same steady, purposeful stroke. He rode back toward the road, and he did not understand for a full mile why he kept glancing back over his shoulder. The heat kept climbing through July, and Clement found reasons to come back. The first time, 4 days later, it was honest enough. He told himself he wanted to check whether the advisory circumstances had changed, which was within the scope of his duties, and which was also completely true. He brought nothing with him except himself and powder, and 3 sections of flexible rubber tubing he had acquired from the hardware concern on Bridge Street, which he knew could be used to create a simple gravity-fed system from a raised barrel to a garden row if one had the materials and the inclination. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, kneeling in the soil with a pair of scissors, cutting the dry outer leaves from her tomato plants to redirect what water was in the stem to the fruit. She looked up when she heard Powder on the road, and she watched him ride in with a look that was not quite suspicious and not quite welcoming, but waiting. He dismounted and held up the rubber tubing. "For irrigation," he said. "If you have a spare barrel you can elevate." She looked at the tubing, then at him. "You brought that out from Dodge." "I had other deliveries in the area," he said, which was true, though those deliveries had been completed yesterday. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and considered him with that slow, careful gaze. Then she said, "I have a barrel I can roll onto the fence rails behind the house. It will hold about 60 gallons. That would give you enough head pressure to run a line to the garden," he said. "Maybe 30 feet. "I know how gravity works," she said. "I did not say you did not." They worked on the irrigation system through the morning, rolling the barrel up onto a platform Clement constructed from fence rails and scraps of lumber he found stacked against the south wall of the soddy, lashing it in place with rope, and running the rubber tubing from the spigot hole down and along the garden rows. It was unglamorous work, heavy and hot, and they did it side by side, and they talked about the work and only the work for the first hour, and then they began to talk about other things. He learned that she had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a merchant who had died when she was 16 and left the family in reduced circumstances. She had a mother and 2 younger sisters still in Missouri, and she sent them money when she had it and letters when she did not. She had met Thomas Brooks at a church social when she was 20 and married him at 21. She had followed him west without hesitation, because she had the quality of conviction that allows a person to commit entirely to a chosen direction, and also because she had wanted wide sky after a childhood of city walls. He told her about Nebraska, about his father's wheat farm and the years of marginal rainfall that had finally broken it in 1878 when Clement was 22, and the land was sold to a larger operation. His father had gone to work for a rail company in Omaha, and his mother had taken a position as a housekeeper for a banker's family. And Clement had drifted south and west with the particular purposeless energy of a young man who has lost his home and is not yet ready to build another one. He had taken the land office position in 1880 and found to his own mild surprise that it suited something in him: the riding, the open land, the occasional usefulness, the solitude that was not quite loneliness as long as he kept moving. "But you keep moving," she said. "You never stay in one place." "I stop for the night." "That is not the same." "No," he said, "it is not." She handed him the end of the tubing to hold against the first row of tomato plants while she went to open the spigot, and water ran through the rubber hose in a slow, steady trickle that sank into the cracked soil with a sound that was almost like a sigh. And Evelyn came back and stood beside him watching it, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was something in watching water reach thirsty ground that did not need commentary. "It is working," she said finally, and her voice was softer than he had heard it. "It is working," he agreed. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, cold cornbread she had baked that morning and preserved peaches from the previous fall and 2 tin cups of strong coffee. And it was the first meal Clement had eaten at a table with another person in longer than he could easily remember, because his work kept him moving, and his rooms in Dodge were above the assay office and smelled of chalk, and he took most of his meals at the counter of a restaurant on Front Street. He noticed the way she set the table, quick and efficient, without fuss, plates and cups placed with the ease of a person for whom hospitality was reflex rather than performance. He noticed the photograph on the mantel, a young man with an earnest expression and a new suit, clearly taken at a studio, clearly Thomas. He noticed that she did not avoid looking at it, but also did not make a thing of it, the way a person keeps a candle burning because the light matters and does not feel the need to explain why. He rode back to Dodge that evening with dust on his coat and a feeling in his chest that he attempted to catalog and categorize and mostly failed. He came back a week later with a 50-pound sack of oats for the horses, which he had purchased from the feed merchant on Spruce Street with his own money, and told himself was a practical gesture, because draft horses that were well fed could haul water from the creek more efficiently, and this was a claim that needed to show active development, and it was therefore within the interests of the land office and not at all personal. He was lying to himself with a thoroughness that would have impressed him in any other context. Evelyn took the oats with a look that saw straight through the explanation he offered and chose not to challenge it, and she made him coffee while he mended a section of the corral fence that had come loose, working with the quiet competence of a man who spent his childhood doing precisely this kind of thing, and never quite lost the knowledge of it. August arrived with no rain and temperatures that pressed down on the plains like a flat iron, and the sky was a white blue that had nothing left to give. Rivers across Kansas were at historic lows, and the newspapers from Dodge City to Wichita were full of reports about ruined harvests and families relocating to Colorado or heading back east. The drought of 1884 would eventually be recorded as one of the most severe in the region's history, and those who lived through it carried the particular scar of a summer when the land simply refused to cooperate with human hope. On Evelyn's claim, the corn was mostly lost by mid-August. She had known it was coming, had watched it happen row by row, and had grieved it quietly in the way that practical people grieve with their hands occupied and their faces forward, and the grief itself folded small and placed somewhere that did not interfere with function. The apple trees were alive. The kitchen garden was reduced but producing. Hazel the cow was thin but milking. The horses were strong. The sod house was standing. She was standing. Clement came on a Saturday in the third week of August, and the day was so hot that Powder was dark with sweat from the ride, and Evelyn met him at the road with a bucket of water for the horse before he had even fully stopped, because she had been watching the road since mid-morning without admitting to herself why. "You need to stop bringing things," she said as he dismounted, because he had a small crate on the back of the saddle. "It is seeds," he said. "Winter wheat, early variety. If you can get it in the ground in September when the temperatures drop, it will overwinter and come up in March. It does not need the same water as corn." She looked at the crate, then at him. Clement. It was the first time she had used his name, and they both noticed it, and neither of them said so. "The land office tracks claims by what is in the ground," he said. "Winter wheat in September is a legitimate improvement. You would be on record as an active claimant." "That is not why you brought it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "it is not." She took the crate. She did not say thank you in so many words, but she looked at him with something that was a language in itself, quiet and certain and warmer than anything she had let him see before. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked. He stayed. She made fried salt pork with the last of the beans from the garden and cornbread and the preserved peaches again, and they sat at the kitchen table while the evening light went golden through the west window, and the temperature finally dropped to something bearable. And they talked, really talked, the way people talk when the practical surface of conversation has worn through and the actual stuff of a person begins to show. She told him about the nights in March after Thomas died, when the sod walls had felt like a grave, and she had sat with a candle until it burned itself out and then sat in the dark rather than go to bed, because sleep felt like surrender. She told him about the morning in April when she had decided to plant anyway, to put seeds into dry ground on a day when the sky had offered nothing, and how that act of planting had been the thing that turned her back toward the world. He told her about the feeling of riding out with those notices, the weight of them, the way it had started to make him feel like a man carrying instruments of failure. He told her that when he had ridden up to her claim that first afternoon, he had expected the same thing he had seen on every other call: abandoned equipment, dry ground, the ghost of a homestead, and that seeing her standing in the field with a hoe had hit him somewhere behind the sternum in a way he was still trying to explain to himself. "I was just working," she said. "I know," he said. "That was it exactly." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup between her hands. The lamplight made everything amber and close, and outside the cicadas were singing in the dry grass. "I am not planning to leave," she said. "I want you to know that. I am not in a fragile state where someone needs to shore me up. I have thought clearly about this. I am staying because this is where I intend to be." "I know that," he said. "I just want to be sure you understand it is not desperation you are seeing when you look at me," she said. "It is choice." "I understand," he said. "It is the most clearly seen thing about you." She looked at him across the table, and the lamplight between them was warm and still, and something passed between them that was not quite said, not yet, but was real enough that both of them felt the shape of it. He rode back to Dodge in the dark, under a sky dense with stars, and Powder moved through the night with sure-footed patience, and Clement rode with his hands loose on the reins and something lifting in him that he had not felt in a long time, the specific, alarming lightness of a man who is beginning, against his better judgment, to fall. The following week, he made a formal request at the land office to be reassigned as the primary agent for the Harlan Flats area for the remainder of the season, citing the concentration of advisory cases in the township and the need for consistent follow-up assessment. His supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald Pratt who had a desk buried in paper and a fondness for efficiency, approved the request without questions. Pratt was happy to remove 4 townships from his general rotation. Clement rode to Evelyn's claim twice in the following week, once to help her haul water from the creek with a wagon and barrel system they worked out together that was significantly more efficient than her previous method, and once to help her clear the dead corn stalks from the field so that the ground could be prepared for the winter wheat planting. They worked side by side, and the conversation between them had grown into something easy and layered, with the quality of comfort that usually takes much longer to develop but sometimes arrives on its own schedule, indifferent to propriety. On the second of those visits, working down opposite ends of the field toward each other, pulling up the brittle stalks and piling them for burning, Evelyn said suddenly, across 15 feet of turned earth, "Do you have someone waiting for you in Dodge?" He looked up. She was not looking at him, was still pulling stalks, her hat brim angled toward the ground. "No," he said, a pause. "I did not think so," she said. "But I wanted to be certain before I continued thinking what I have been thinking." "What have you been thinking?" he asked. She straightened and looked at him then, square and clear, with the characteristic directness that he was coming to understand was not bluntness but honesty, a genuine preference for clarity over comfortable vagueness. "I have been thinking that you come here more than the land office requires," she said. "And I have been thinking that I am glad when you do. And I have been thinking that I am not the kind of woman who benefits from not saying the thing that is true, because I have found that silence on important subjects tends to allow for misunderstandings that complicate matters unnecessarily." He set down the stalks he was holding and crossed the 15 feet between them, which felt both very short and very long, and he stopped in front of her with the afternoon sun behind him and the dry field around them and the smell of turned earth in the air. "You are right that I come here more than required," he said, And I should be honest with you that the nature of it has changed for me since the first day. Changed how? She asked, and her voice was steady but her eyes were very attentive. When I rode up that first afternoon, he said, I thought I was delivering a notice. I was not prepared for you. She tilted her chin up slightly, the way she did when something landed in her that she needed a moment to accommodate. What does that mean exactly? It means I would like to keep coming here, he said. Not as a land agent, not because the office requires it. I would like to come here the way a man comes to see a woman he finds himself unable to stop thinking about, if she is willing to receive him on those terms. The wind moved between them, carrying dust and the dry smell of August, and Evelyn looked at him for a long, considered moment, and then she said, I suppose I could receive you on those terms. There was no theatrical moment, no sudden rain or sweeping gesture, just the two of them standing in a failing cornfield in the heat of late summer, and Clement reached out and took her hand, which was rough with work and warm from the sun, and she let him hold it, and that was how it was between them, not dramatic in the conventional sense but absolutely real, the way the best things are. He was there the next Saturday and the one after that, and by September the character of his visits had shifted entirely into something that was openly about her rather than about the claim. He brought her a book he thought she would like, a collection of essays on natural philosophy, and was rewarded with the genuine delight she could not quite contain when she unwrapped it, turning it over in her hands with the particular pleasure of a woman who reads and has been starved of new reading material for months. She read him a passage aloud that evening by lamplight while he repaired a hinge on the kitchen door, and he worked with half his attention on the hinge and all of the rest of it on the sound of her voice. The winter wheat went into the ground in the first week of September, two of them working the rows together with the seed drill Thomas had bought, and Clement had helped service into working condition. The earth was still dry but not impossible. There had been one brief rain in late August that had amounted to less than half an inch, but had been received like a blessing anyway. And the seeds went in with the particular faith of a planting done in uncertain conditions, the kind of faith that does not ask for guarantees before it acts. They stood at the edge of the freshly planted field as the light went orange and the first whisper of autumn came in on the wind, cooling the back of the neck and carrying the suggestion of change, and Evelyn put her hands on her hips and looked at what they had done, and then she looked at him. Thank you, she said, for all of it, the tubing, the seeds, the fence, the hauling. I was glad to, he said. I know you were, she said. That is what makes it different. He looked at her, the light going amber on her face, her hair coming loose from its pins in the way it always did by late afternoon, and something in him that had been holding itself carefully since March finally, quietly let go. Evelyn, he said. Yes, he took a breath. He was not as established, a man who talked more than necessary, but there were moments when silence was not careful. It was cowardly, and he knew the difference. I have something to say that I want to say plainly because you deserve plain dealing, he said. She turned to face him fully, her expression open and serious. I am in love with you, he said. I did not plan it and I cannot map exactly when it happened, but there it is. And I am not saying it to press you or to complicate things or to take advantage of the circumstances. I am saying it because I think you should know, and because you are the kind of woman who deserves to make decisions with accurate information. She was very still for a moment. The wind moved through the new-turned soil and lifted the loose ends of her hair. That is, she said, the most practical declaration of love I have ever heard. Is it a problem? He asked. No, she said, and the word came out quiet and sure and a little breathless, as though it had been waiting behind a door that had just opened. No, it is not a problem, because I have been in love with you since you said you have a point and meant it, and that was months ago, and I have been very patient. He laughed, a real laugh, full and surprised, and she laughed with him, and it was the first time either of them had laughed that way in longer than they could say, and it rang out into the dry September evening and scattered. He stepped toward her and she stepped toward him at the same moment, and he took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a breath and then kissed her, gently and with complete intention, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which, as was consistent with her character, was considerable. The apple trees rustled in the evening wind behind them, alive and still growing. Clement spoke to Evelyn on a Sunday morning in October, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with the smell of her coffee in the air, and the autumn light coming in clear and cool through the west window, making everything in the room look like something worth preserving. "I need to tell you something about my position," he said, "because it affects what I am hoping to ask you." She put down her cup and looked at him. "I have been offered a supervisor's position at the land office," he said. "It would mean less riding and more desk work, which I have been resisting because I know what I am on a horse and I am less certain what I am behind a desk. But it would mean a consistent salary and a consistent location, no more circuit riding." "In Dodge?" she asked. "Yes." "But Dodge is 30 miles from here." "I know how far it is," she said. "I am not saying this to be complicated," he said. "I am working towards something. I want you to know the practical shape of what I am offering before I offer it." She looked at him steadily. "Then offer it." "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to come here and be on this land with you. I will take the supervisor position, which will allow me to be here during the weeks and handle office work by correspondence when I need to. The land office owes me 8 weeks of back pay, and I have savings enough that we could get through the winter and into spring without strain. What I am hoping, if you are willing, is that we could build this together. Your claim, your land, my hands, both of us." She was quiet for a moment, and during that moment Clement sat with his heart in his throat and the very particular vulnerability of a man who has offered everything he has and is waiting to see if it is enough. "I said I would not leave," she said. "I remember. And I said I stay by choice, not desperation. I remember that too. So I want you to be clear," she said, "that my answer has nothing to do with circumstance. It is not because I need someone to haul water or mend fences." "I am clear," he said. "My answer is yes," she said. "Because I love you, and because this land needs 2 people who love it, and because I have been thinking for 2 months about what the rest of my life looks like, and you have been in every version of it." He got up from his chair and she stood from hers, and he held her for a long time in the middle of the kitchen, in the cool October light, and neither of them said anything, and nothing needed to be said. They married in November, in the small Methodist church at the edge of Harlan Flats that served the scattered homestead families of the area. It was a modest ceremony by any standard. The minister and his wife, 2 neighboring farm families who had become Evelyn's closest neighbors over the past 2 years, the land office supervisor Gerald Pratt, who drove out from Dodge in a rented buggy with his wife and a bottle of decent bourbon, and a young woman named Clara Jennings, who had befriended Evelyn in the dark months after Thomas died and had ridden 7 miles to stand beside her now. Evelyn wore her best dress, a dark green wool that brought out the warmth in her eyes, and her hair was pinned carefully with 2 ivory combs that had been her mother's. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers, prairie coneflowers, and a few preserved stems of goldenrod, tied with a piece of ribbon, because fresh flowers were not a thing the season offered, and the dried ones were beautiful in their own particular way, persistent and honest. Clement stood at the front of the church in a clean broadcloth suit he had ordered from the tailor on Front Street in Dodge, and when Evelyn walked in he looked at her with an expression that was not theatrical in any way but was absolutely transparent, the face of a man who is seeing exactly what he wants and knows it, and several people in the church remarked later that it was one of the more affecting things they had witnessed. The ceremony was brief and sincere. The minister asked them to repeat the promises, and they did, looking at each other and meaning every syllable. And when it was done, Clement held her hand and they walked out of the church into a November day that was cold and bright with the particular crystalline quality of early winter on the Kansas plains. And the sky was blue and enormous, and the dead grass along the road was copper and silver in the light, and it was beautiful. The reception was at Evelyn's. At their claim, the sod house warm with the stove and the kerosene lamps and the body heat of a dozen people crowded into 3 rooms, and someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else had brought a guitar, and there was dancing in the main room with the furniture pushed to the walls, and the bourbon was poured, and Evelyn laughed more that afternoon than she had laughed in all of the preceding year combined, and Clement danced with her badly but with great willingness. And she pressed her forehead to his shoulder and felt the solid, real warmth of him and thought, yes, this is the right direction. Their neighbor, a homesteader named Wallace Briggs, who had farmed the section west of Evelyn's for 3 years and who had a big, weathered face and a gentle manner that didn't match his size, raised a glass and gave a toast that was short and clear. To 2 people who stayed when the land was hard and found each other in it. There is not a better story than that. They drank. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was cold and still, and the drought eased by degrees in the way that droughts sometimes do, not with dramatic relief, but with a slow return, a few inches here, a light snow there, the gradual recalibration of weather patterns that had been running dry for too long. By February there was snow on the ground in real quantity, and when it melted in March it went into the soil slowly, deeply, the way snowmelt does, and Evelyn stood at the edge of the wheat field on the first morning she saw green breaking through the dead pale surface of the soil and pressed her hand to her mouth and stood there for a long time. Clement came up beside her and looked at what she was looking at and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. "It worked," she said. "You worked," he said. "The wheat just agreed." She turned and looked at him. "We worked," she corrected. "We did," he agreed. The wheat came in strong that spring, a good stand of the winter variety that had overwintered well, and was now showing the particular vivid green of a crop that has survived something. The apple trees bloomed for the first time, 6 small, determined trees putting out their white and pink blossoms. The orchard Thomas had planted now producing its first real show of flowers, and Evelyn walked through them on a May morning when the bees were working, and the air smelled like the beginning of everything, and she felt both the grief and the gratitude simultaneously, the way the fullest moments do, the ones that hold 2 things at once. She had written to her mother in Missouri in January, after the wedding, a long letter that explained everything: the drought, the claim, Thomas's death, the winter. Clement and her mother had written back in a hand that showed some trembling, but with words that were clear and kind, expressing relief that Evelyn was not alone, and saying that she had always known her oldest daughter would carve something lasting out of whatever she was given. Clement, as promised, took the supervisor position at the land office in March. He rode to Dodge on Monday mornings and returned on Thursday evenings, and the 3 days of the week without him were busy enough that Evelyn managed them without difficulty. But the moment on Thursday when she heard Powder's hooves on the road and the gate swing open was one she did not try to diminish or rationalize. She was glad. She walked out to meet him. It was that simple. He was different at the desk than she had imagined. She had thought the indoor work might chafe at him, and it did some, but he was also better at it than he had expected himself to be. He had a practical intelligence and a real knowledge of the land and the law and the people involved, and Gerald Pratt discovered quickly that Clement's field experience made him an exceptionally useful supervisor, one who could read between the lines of a field agent's report and know whether the situation on the ground matched what was written. He began, quietly and through proper channels, to push back on the more aggressive implementation of the drought advisory notices that had been his own particular burden for the past 2 years. He wrote a formal recommendation to the Regional Land Office Authority in Topeka, arguing that the advisory notices, as currently implemented, were being used effectively as removal tools in circumstances where the Homestead Act did not legally support removal, and that the proper course of action was to extend cultivation timelines during documented weather events of significant severity. The recommendation was received with polite skepticism, and then, 2 months later, with a modified policy that adopted several of his key points. It was not a revolution, but it meant that fewer people would have a notice delivered to their door in the middle of a drought and interpret it as an eviction, and that, Clement thought, was something. He told Evelyn about the policy change one evening in June, sitting on the low bench outside the front door of the soddy while the evening cooled and the wheat field to the north rustled with a real wind coming from the south, a warm and welcome wind. "How many families do you think it will help?" she asked. "Hard to say. In a bad drought year, maybe 2 or 3 dozen across the region, maybe more. 2 or 3 dozen families," she said quietly. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the field, at the wheat that was approaching harvest, at the apple trees visible to the east with their first small fruits now forming on the branches. "Good," she said. "That is a good thing you did." "It is the least complicated version of it," he said. "The larger problem is that the act itself was written without accounting for the actual conditions on the plains. 160 acres sounds like a lot, and it is, but what it produces in a drought year is not enough to sustain a family and prove up a claim simultaneously. The policy needs to change at a deeper level." "Will it?" "Not quickly," he said. "These things move slowly. But someone has to keep saying it." She looked at him with that warm, clear gaze. "Then keep saying it." The wheat harvest in July of 1885 was not spectacular, but it was solid, the kind of yield that a careful farmer calls good in a year that has been difficult, and it filled the grain sacks in the barn and gave them enough to sell a portion to the merchant in town and to set aside seed for the next planting. Evelyn walked the rows at harvest with a particular gravity, touching the heavy heads of grain, and she thought about the morning she had stood in the dying cornfield with a hoe and a land agent on a dun horse had come up the road with a letter in his saddlebag. And she thought about everything that had unfolded from that afternoon, and she found she could not quite hold the scale of it. How a drought had taken everything Thomas had planted, and yet from that loss had grown something she had not anticipated and could not now imagine being without. She did not say any of this aloud because some things were true without needing to be spoken, but she carried it with her through the harvest, and it made her work with her whole self. In September, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. She made the calculation carefully, confirmed it as well as it could be confirmed without a physician's examination, and then sat with the knowledge for 2 days before she told Clement, not out of fear, but because she wanted to be sure, and because she was a woman who preferred certainty to impression. She told him on a Thursday evening when he returned from Dodge, walking out to meet him as she always did, waiting until he had stabled powder and washed the road dust from his face at the yard pump, and then following him into the kitchen where the supper was keeping warm on the stove, and saying, without preamble because she did not believe in preamble, "I am with child." He turned from hanging his coat on the hook by the door and looked at her with an expression that moved through several registers very quickly: surprise, understanding, and then something so open and undisguised that it was almost difficult to witness, a kind of unguarded joy that she had not seen on his face before in quite that form. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and held her, and she felt him exhale as though he had been holding something in and had finally let it go. "When?" he asked, his voice low against her hair. "April," she said, "or close to it." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and fine. And a little uncertain." "We will manage it," he said. "I know we will," she said. "That is not what the uncertainty is about." He looked at her, waiting. "It is just large," she said. "The feeling of it, I did not expect it to feel so large." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I know," he said. "It does feel large." They stood like that for a while, in the warm kitchen, with the supper cooling on the stove and the prairie outside going dark and quiet under a September sky, and the world inside that room was very full. Evelyn wrote to her mother and sisters in Missouri that same week, and the letter she wrote was one of those letters that carries in it more than the words can quite contain. All the news, all the gratitude, and underneath it all the particular courage of a woman who has been through loss and drought and isolation, and has come out the other side not diminished, but enlarged, carrying her grief alongside her joy as though they are simply both real, and there is no reason one must displace the other. Her mother wrote back immediately, a quick letter full of practical advice, and an announcement that she intended to come to Kansas the following spring and meet her new son-in-law and her grandchild with her own eyes, and that nothing on earth was going to prevent it. Clement began, in October, to build. He had been thinking about the house since summer, since it had become clear that the soddy, which was fine for one person and workable for two, was going to be insufficient for a growing family. He was not a master carpenter, but he was a man who had grown up building things on a Nebraska farm, and he had knowledge and patience and access, through the land office, to materials and craftsmen in Dodge who could supplement what he could not do himself. He ordered lumber in October, negotiating with the mill in town for a fair price, and the lumber arrived by wagon in 2 loads, and Clement began framing a proper frame house to be attached to the east side of the existing soddy, which would remain standing as a kitchen and storage structure. He worked on it every evening and on the weekends through October and November, and Wallace Briggs came over on Saturdays with his 2 grown sons and worked alongside him, because that was how it was done on the prairie. You helped your neighbor because someday the need would be in the other direction, and the web of mutual labor was what made individual survival possible. Evelyn, for her part, was not the kind of pregnant woman who retreated from her work. She continued the morning chores and the apple tree care and the careful preparation of the soil for the next planting, and she modified what she did as her body required it without complaint, because she did not believe in complaint as a primary response to difficulty. But she allowed herself, in small and meaningful ways, to accept help, to let Clement carry the heavier things, to sit in the evenings rather than work through to lamplight, to write a letter to Clara Jennings asking if Clara might be able to come and stay in the weeks before and after the baby's arrival. Clara wrote back yes with a promptness that made it clear she had been waiting to be asked. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was mild by Kansas standards, and the rains, when they came properly, not in the desperate downpour of a summer storm but in the steady, soaking way of a season returning to itself. By January, there was a decent snowpack and Evelyn walked the claim in the quiet of a snowfall, the world reduced to white and gray and the soft sounds of winter, and felt a deep, cellular satisfaction that had nothing to do with the temporary and everything to do with the permanent. The house was framed and roofed by December, and the interior work continued through the winter at whatever pace the weather and the daylight allowed. By the time February arrived, there were 2 proper rooms, a main room with a real floor and a fireplace, and a bedroom, and Clement had made, with his own hands and a fair amount of cursing and several consultations with a furniture maker in Dodge named Abernathy, a cradle from the spare lumber, sanded smooth and built solid, a piece of furniture that was not beautiful in any decorative sense but was real and sturdy and made with the kind of intention that is its own form of beauty. He brought it in one evening and set it in the corner of the bedroom, and Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then she looked at him. "You made that," she said. "Badly," he said. "Not badly," she said. "Solidly, which is better." He looked at the cradle, which was, in fact, solid with square, honest joints and a level floor and rockers cut carefully from curved branch wood. It was not the kind of cradle that appeared in parlor illustrations, but it was the kind that would survive 20 years of use. "I thought," he said, "that if it lasted we might have use of it more than once." She looked at him with that warmth she had gradually stopped modulating. "More than once," she said. "If that is agreeable to you," he said. "It is agreeable to me," she said. Their son was born in April of 1886, on a morning when the apple trees were in full bloom, and the winter wheat had already broken the soil in long, even rows of green, and the sky over the Kansas plains was an enormous tender blue that seemed to have been arranged specifically for the occasion, though Evelyn, in the throes of labor, was not attending much to the sky. Clara Jennings was there, and a midwife from the settlement at Rock Creek named Mrs. Adelheid Fisher, who had delivered half the babies in 4 townships and who had the calm, matter-of-fact authority of a woman who has attended enough births to know that the body is capable and that the right job is support and watchfulness, not intervention. Clement was in the main room. He had been banished from the bedroom by Mrs. Fisher not unkindly but very firmly, and he sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands together, and did not move for 4 hours, listening to the sounds of the birth with the particular helpless alertness of a man whose entire world is on the other side of a door. When Mrs. Fisher opened the door and said, "A boy, Mr. Keller, and your wife is well," he stood up so fast that he knocked his knee into the table and did not notice. He walked into the bedroom and Evelyn was there, propped against the pillows, her face flushed and exhausted and more fully alive than he had ever seen her, which was saying something, and she was holding in her arms a small red-faced creature wrapped in a square of flannel, and she looked up at Clement with an expression that contained everything, the exhaustion and the love and the shock of it and the deep, private recognition of a thing that has just become permanently true. "Come and meet him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and she shifted the baby toward him, and he held his son for the first time, the weight of him specific and astonishing, and the baby's face was round and flushed, and his eyes were pressed shut in the focused concentration of the newly arrived, and Clement held him and felt something he had no language for, something that simply was and was enormous. "What do we call him?" Evelyn asked. They had discussed names but not settled. "Thomas," Clement said, "if you want." "For his father." She looked at him, and her eyes filled, not with sadness but with something larger, something that was both grief and gratitude at once, the full acknowledgement of both the man who had brought her here and the man who was staying. "Thomas," she agreed. "Thomas Clement Keller." He bent and pressed a kiss to her hair, and she leaned into him. And the baby Thomas Clement Keller slept in his father's arms in the April morning with the apple blossoms outside the window and the wheat in the field, and the whole long arc of a story that had started with a drought and a notice and a woman with a hoe arriving here in this room, in this beginning. Evelyn's mother arrived in May, as promised. She came by train to Dodge City and Clement drove to town to collect her in the wagon. And she was a small woman with the same brown eyes as her daughter, and an expression of careful assessment that was clearly the origin of Evelyn's own. And she sized Clement up on the wagon seat over the 30 miles of road between Dodge and Harlan Flats, with the thoroughness of a woman who has raised a daughter alone and loves her without reservation. By the time they arrived at the claim, she had largely completed her assessment and had reached, it was clear, a positive conclusion, because she stepped down from the wagon and looked at the house and the apple trees and the wheat field and the kitchen garden and turned to Clement and said, "You built this." "Most of it," he said, "with help from neighbors. And the irrigation, Evelyn's system mostly. I only brought the tubing." She looked at him steadily. "That is a generous accounting," she said. "I suspect the truth is somewhat less modest." Evelyn came out of the house at that moment with Thomas on her hip, and the look on Evelyn's mother's face when she saw her daughter and her grandchild was the kind of look that does not need to be described to be understood. It was everything, written plainly. She stayed 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks she baked bread every morning, which was a gift, and held Thomas with the practiced ease of a woman who has raised 3 children, which was a greater one. And she and Evelyn talked in the evenings the way mothers and daughters talk when they have been separated and have things that have accumulated, real things, not the surface conversation of letters. And the talking went long and was sometimes difficult and sometimes funny and always necessary. On her last evening, she sat with Clement on the bench outside the front door after Evelyn had gone in to put Thomas down, and the prairie evening was warm and full of insect sound, and she said to him, "She is happy." "I know," he said. "Not in the temporary way," she said. "In the steady way, the kind that builds on itself." "That is what I am hoping for," he said. "It is what I see," she said, and her voice was quiet and factual and completely sincere, and it was one of the finest compliments he had ever received. She left on the 1st of July with a basket of apples, the first real fruit from the orchard, small and sweet and improbable, wrapped in cloth for the journey, and she stood on the wagon seat and looked back at the claim as Clement drove her toward the road, and then she faced forward and did not look back again, because she was also the kind of woman who committed to a direction and moved in it. The years that followed were the kind of years that become the foundation of a family's story. Not easy, because the plains never became easy, but good. The kind of good that is built through accumulated seasons and shared labor, and the ordinary daily intimacy of two people who have chosen each other with clear eyes and keep choosing each other. The winter wheat became their primary crop. Clement, through his land office connections and his ongoing advocacy work with the Topeka Regional Office, helped establish what would become a small but real shift in how homestead claims in drought-prone areas were assessed, and several dozen families kept their claims through difficult seasons partly as a result of policies he had written and argued for. He left the land office in 1888 to work the claim full-time, because by then the farm was producing well enough to support them without the salary, and because he had done what he could from inside the system and felt the land calling him in a more direct way. He was, as it turned out, very good at farming, better than he had let himself imagine, in the years when farming meant his father's loss and the open road had seemed like the only available identity. He understood soil and weather and the particular negotiations of dry country agriculture, and he and Evelyn worked the land together with a collaboration that was efficient and affectionate, full of the small arguments that productive partnerships produce and the larger agreements that underlie them. They argued about the Eastfield rotation in 1888, and Evelyn was right, and he admitted it without excessive drama. He argued that the orchard needed a windbreak planting to the north, and she thought it was unnecessary. And they compromised and planted half of what he had suggested, and the following winter the trees were noticeably less stressed, and she acknowledged this with a look that was simultaneously conceding and deeply amused. Thomas Clement Keller grew into a sturdy, brown-eyed boy who could ride at 3, and was helping with the light harvest work at 4, and who asked questions with the persistent, unembarrassed curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that curiosity is sometimes inconvenient. He was deeply attached to both his parents but had, from a very young age, a quality of watching the world that reminded Evelyn, in a different, childlike form, of the way Clement watched the land, with patience and focus and a lack of sentimentality that would serve him well. In 1889, Evelyn was pregnant again, and this time she told Clement before she had fully confirmed it because she was no longer a woman who sat alone with important information waiting for certainty. And he took her hands across the kitchen table, and they looked at each other with the full, grounded gladness of people who have been through something and come out the other side and know what this is and what it is worth. The second child was a girl, born in January of 1890 in the same room with the same midwife, Mrs. Fisher was still practicing and had delivered so many babies in the area that Evelyn sometimes thought the woman must be held together by determination alone, and Evelyn named her Ruth, which was a name she had carried in her mind for a long time and which meant something to her about steadfastness, about the quality of remaining with what you have chosen when remaining is hard. Ruth Keller came into the world in a January ice storm, the wind raging outside with the particular violence of a plains winter at its worst, and the house was warm and bright with the fire and the kerosene, and Mrs. Fisher delivered her with calm efficiency and handed her to Evelyn wrapped in flannel, and Evelyn looked at her daughter's face dark-haired already, which neither she nor Clement was, and felt the overwhelming specific love of that moment, which does not diminish with repetition but if anything deepens. Clement was allowed in this time. Mrs. Fisher had apparently revised her policy between births, or perhaps she had made an exception given the storm, and the fact that the alternative was a very anxious man sitting in a room with a 4-year-old asking questions. He came in quietly and stood at the foot of the bed looking at his daughter in Evelyn's arms with an expression that was by now familiar to her, that particular unguarded openness that he wore only at the fullest moments, the face underneath the face. "Ruth," Evelyn said, "what do you think?" He looked at the baby for a long moment. "She has opinions already," he said. "I can tell." Evelyn laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and then settled, and Thomas, who had been allowed in to see his sister, came and stood beside the bed and looked at her with the serious, judicial expression of a 4-year-old confronted with a new fact. "She is very small," he said. "She will grow," Clement said. "Will she be any help?" Thomas asked. Clement looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Clement. "Eventually," Evelyn said, keeping her face entirely straight. The claim at Harlan Flats continued to grow and develop through the early 1890s, and what had been a single desperate cornfield and a struggling kitchen garden became, over years of careful, intelligent labor, a functioning and genuinely productive farm. The apple orchard reached its mature years in 1892 and produced its first real crop, 20 bushels of good apples that Evelyn preserved, dried, and sold the surplus of at the Harlan Flats General Store and at the market in Dodge. The wheat fields had been expanded. The irrigation system had been improved twice. Clement learned from a Mennonite farmer to the west named Hieronymus Schrock a technique for dryland terracing that significantly reduced water loss from the upper fields. And the kitchen garden had been turned into something that produced enough vegetables to feed the family through winter from preserves alone. The horses had been expanded to a small working team of 4, and Hazel the cow had been supplemented by 3 more milk cows, and the dairy production was small but real. The milk sold to 2 neighboring families and the butter sold at the store. It was not a large operation by the standards of the bigger homesteads, but it was theirs, and it worked, and it had been built from the worst year, from the drought and the loss and the notice in a saddlebag. And that origin gave it a particular quality of meaning that neither of them ever lost track of. Clement, in these years, found himself becoming a person he had not entirely anticipated. Not just a farmer, but a man with a reputation in the community for fair dealing and practical knowledge. He was asked to settle a water rights dispute between 2 neighboring homesteaders in 1890 and managed it to both parties' reasonable satisfaction. He testified in Topeka in 1891 on behalf of a coalition of small homesteaders, challenging an aggressive land acquisition by a railroad company that was attempting to use eminent domain to absorb several claims in the county. The railroad company did not prevail on the specific claims he testified about, and though the larger battle between small landowners and railroad expansion was a long and complicated one, and one that did not always go in the homesteaders' favor, because the railroads had money and political influence, and the law was often written to accommodate them. Clement's testimony was clear and well documented, and it mattered. He came home from that testimony trip to Topeka in late October of 1891 to find Evelyn in the apple orchard on a ladder, reaching for a late cluster of fruit that had been missed in the earlier harvest, and he stood at the base of the ladder and held it steady without her asking, and she came down with the apples in her apron and kissed him, and they stood in the orchard in the October afternoon, the leaves going gold and red around them, the smell of the fruit sweet and real. "How did it go?" she asked. "It went well, I think. We will see what they do with it." "You did the right thing going," she said. "I almost did not," he said. "I did not want to leave." She looked at him with that warm, clear steadiness that had not diminished in 7 years. "The children and I are not going anywhere," she said. "Neither is the land. Do the good thing when the good thing is available to do. He looked at her for a moment in the orchard light. When did you become this wise? He said. I have always been this wise, she said. You were just late to notice. He laughed. Wallace Briggs, their neighbor to the west, died in the winter of 1892. He had been ailing since autumn, a slow decline that he managed with the stoic matter-of-factness of a man who has worked hard all his life and does not intend to make a fuss at its end. And he died in his sleep in December, which was, as his daughter Margaret said at the burial, probably exactly how he would have wanted it. Evelyn and Clement were at the burial, and it was a small gathering of the neighbors who had known him, and the minister said appropriate words over the frozen ground, and afterward Evelyn stood at the graveside longer than the others, because Wallace Briggs had been one of the first friends of her life in Harlan Flats, and she owed him kindness she had not fully paid back and now could not. She thought, standing there, about how the people and the land in this place were braided together, in a way that the loss of one was always also a change in the other. And she thought that this was what it meant to root somewhere, not just to plant seeds, but to be affected by the place's losses as well as its yields, to be changed by the winter as well as the harvest. She was glad she had stayed. She was glad every day that she had not signed a paper and gone back east. And she was glad with a gratitude that was larger than any single word, for the land agent who had come on a dun horse with a letter and had said, "You have a point," and had meant it. She told Clement this on the ride home from Wallace's burial, sitting beside him on the wagon seat with the children inside the wagon bed behind them under a quilt, both asleep from the cold, and the winter prairie spreading wide and white and silent in every direction. "I want to say something," she said. He looked at her. "I think about that first day fairly often," she said, "when you rode up." "So do I," he said. "You could have just delivered the notice and left," she said. "You had done it 100 times. You had no obligation to stay and talk, no obligation to say I was right." "You were right," he said simply. "But you acknowledged it," she said. "A different man would not have. A different man would have left that notice and ridden away, and I might have signed it. I do not know. I would like to think I would not have. But the certainty I feel now was not the same certainty I had that afternoon. I was holding on, Clement, by my fingernails." He was quiet, the horse's hooves steady on the frozen road. "The drought had taken everything I had planted," she said. "It had taken Thomas in a way, though not directly. It had taken the future I had been building. But it had not taken me. And when you rode up I was still there, still in that field, still with a hoe, and I did not know quite what to do with my own continued presence." "I know," he said. "I could see that." "And then you said I had a point," she said. "And it sounds like a small thing, but it was not a small thing. It was someone seeing that I was right in saying so, and that was the first moment in months that I felt the ground under me as solid." He put his hand over hers on the wagon seat. "Evelyn, I am not telling you this so you will feel responsible," she said. "I am telling you because it is true and because I think you deserve to know the full weight of what you did that day. Not just the surface of it." He looked at her, the winter light on her face, her brown eyes steady and warm. The woman she was in full clarity, complicated and capable and loving and blunt and brave in the most bone-deep, non-dramatic way, the bravery that does not announce itself because it cannot afford to. "The drought had taken the claim from under you," he said, "but you were still there." "I was," she said. "That was enough," he said. "For everything that came after, you being there was the whole basis of it. If you had gone, there would have been nothing for me to come back to." She looked at him for a long moment, and the wagon moved through the white silence of the Kansas winter, and their children slept behind them, and the horses were steady and sure on the frozen road. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. He held her hand all the way home. The homestead at Harlan Flats was proved up in 1892, 8 years after Evelyn had first put seeds into its ground with Thomas Brooks, and the certificate of land ownership arrived in an envelope from the government offices in Topeka, and Clement brought it in from the mailbox on the road and set it on the kitchen table, and Evelyn looked at it for a long time before opening it. It was the official document she had always known was possible and had not fully believed she would hold. 160 acres. Proved. Hers. Theirs. She placed it in the tin document box on the shelf in the main room, next to Thomas Brooks's death notice from the county recorder and their marriage certificate and the children's birth records, all the paper evidence of the things that had been lost and built and begun in this place, all of it together. Clement watched her put it away and saw in the careful way she placed it, in the slight pause of her hand before she closed the tin, the full weight and meaning of it for her. He said nothing, because there was nothing to add. She closed the tin, turned, and looked at the room around her, the real floor, the stone fireplace, the windows with the curtains she had made from fabric bought in Dodge the previous spring, the lamp on the table, the photographs on the mantel now including Thomas Brooks and her mother and sisters, and a photograph taken at the photographer's studio in Dodge of herself and Clement and the children, Thomas holding his hat and Ruth reaching for something out of frame, and she breathed. "We proved it," she said. "We did," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said, "for every mile of it. Thank you," he said, "for staying in that field." The years continued to accumulate in the way that good years do, each one bringing its own weather and its own negotiation, its own yield and its own losses, but all of them founded on the thing that had been established in the worst year, when the drought had come and the corn had died, and a woman had refused to be moved. Ruth Keller, growing up on the homestead, had from an early age an affinity for the apple orchard that her parents found both amusing and apt. She spent hours among the trees, climbing when she was small, pruning with surprising accuracy when she was older, and she was the one who noticed in 1893 that one of the older trees was developing a particular sweetness in its fruit that distinguished it from the others, and she saved its seeds and grew 3 new trees from them, which became the basis of the extended orchard that the farm would be known for in later years. Thomas, meanwhile, proved to have inherited both his mother's directness and his father's practical intelligence, and by 12 he was managing the wheat planting with a maturity that made grown men take him seriously without condescension, which was the only way he would have accepted it. The neighboring section, Wallace Briggs's old claim, was sold by the Briggs family in 1893 to a young couple from Indiana, newly arrived with 3 children and optimism, and the particular greenness of people who have never farmed Prairie. Evelyn and Clement went over the first week and brought food and practical advice, the way the community had operated since before they had known it, the web of mutual survival that prairie life demanded and created simultaneously. The Howards, Daniel and Miriam, were grateful in the way of people who arrive expecting hardship and find unexpected kindness, and they became friends of the kind that the proximity and the shared conditions of the land produced, close and practical and real. Evelyn taught Miriam Howard the dry farming techniques, the irrigation approach, the rhythm of the prairie seasons, not from a position of superiority, but from the place of someone who had learned the hard way and wanted to give someone else a shorter route. Miriam was a quick learner and had her own knowledge to offer in exchange. She was an accomplished herbal physician in the practical folk tradition, and what she knew about plant medicine and preservation complemented what Evelyn had developed in her years of managing the kitchen garden. Their friendship became one of the lasting fixtures of both their lives. In 1895, Clement's mother came from Nebraska. His father had died of a stroke the previous year. The rail company job had never suited him and the years had been hard. And his mother, who had been keeping house for the banker's family, had reached an age and a situation where the arrangement was no longer tenable. She was 62 years old and not fragile but alone, and when Clement wrote and asked if she would come to Kansas, she had written back a single sentence: "I was wondering when you would ask." Her name was Harriet Keller, and she was a small, sharp-witted woman with white hair and a manner that made it clear she had not survived 62 Kansas and Nebraska years by being anything other than entirely competent. She and Evelyn looked each other over the first afternoon with the careful reciprocal assessment of two self-possessed women meeting on equal ground, and reached a mutual understanding that was expressed primarily through practical cooperation, rather than any formal declaration. Harriet took over a portion of the bread baking and the cheese making, which freed Evelyn for field work and the continued development of the orchard. She also, quietly and without being asked, became the primary reader to the children in the evenings, which Thomas and Ruth received with the wholehearted engagement of children who love books and have not had a grandparent's full attention before. The soddy, the original three-room house with its earth walls became Harriet's rooms, rebuilt and improved for her, with a proper floor Clement laid, and a stove she had brought from Nebraska and window curtains she made herself in the first week, which was her way of making a thing her own. She lived there, on the Keller homestead in Harlan Flats, for the next 16 years, until she died at 78 in 1911, in her own bed, with the windows open and the apple orchard visible, and she was buried on the eastern edge of the property where she had asked to be buried, and the apple tree Ruth had grown from special seed was planted at the head of the grave, which seemed right. But that was years ahead. In the 1890s, which were the years of the family's establishing, the homestead was full of life and work, and the particular richness of a place that has been built by people who love it. Clement turned 40 in 1896, and Evelyn threw him a gathering that he had not expected. A celebration that brought in the neighbors across several miles, the Howards and the Schrocks from the west, and a family of Czech homesteaders named Novak who had settled south of the creek, and who came with their 4 children and a smoked ham. And the gathering lasted an entire afternoon, and into the evening with music and food, and the kind of specific joy that the Prairie sometimes produces in its people. The joy that has been earned by surviving and persisting and staying. Clement stood at the edge of the gathering as the sun went down, watching the people, his children running with the other children, Evelyn talking with Miriam Howard by the kitchen door, Harriet seated with old Mrs. Schrock in a conversation that was entirely in German and English simultaneously, but seemed to function perfectly well, the Novak children trying to teach Thomas a Czech song, and he felt a fullness that was not sentiment but substance, the weight of a life that had become genuinely itself. Evelyn came to stand beside him, having seen him separate himself from the gathering, because she always saw it when he went quiet inside, even in the midst of noise. "Are you well?" She said. "More than well," he said. "I was just looking." She looked with him for a moment. "It is a good thing to look at," she said. "It is," he said. "It started with a drought." She took his arm. "Most good things do," she said. "They start with the worst thing and then they become something else." He looked at her face at 37, which was not the face of the girl in St. Louis or the bride in the green wool dress or the woman in the blue dress with the hoe, but was all of those and itself additionally, the face of a life fully lived in a place that had asked everything of her and had received it, and he felt again, as he had felt in the best moments of the last 12 years, the specific and enduring wonder of having found her. "You know," he said, "the day I rode up with that notice, I thought it was the worst errand I had ever run. And now," she said, "now I think it was the best thing I ever did," he said, "even though I almost did not do it right." She looked at him with those brown eyes, warm and clear and faintly amused. "You did it right enough," she said. "You said I had a point." "You did have a point," he said. "I generally do," she said. He laughed and she laughed with him, and behind them the gathering hummed on into the prairie evening, and the apple trees stood in the last light, full-grown and bearing, their branches heavy with the fruit of the years that had been planted in the worst season and tended through every one that followed. The stars came out, thick and clear above the Kansas plains, the same stars that had been there the first night he had ridden away from her claim with something lifting in his chest that he had not yet named. He knew its name now. He had known it for many years. It was the same thing it had always been, simple and enormous, built on the foundation of 2 people who had chosen each other and chosen the land and chosen, every season to stay. The wheat was in the ground. The apples were on the trees. The children were laughing in the evening air. Harriet was in her rooms in the old soddy with the lamplight warm in the window. The neighbors were here. The prairie was full of the particular late summer cricket and nighthawk sounds that meant the world was alive and proceeding. And Clement Keller stood beside Evelyn Brooks Keller under the stars on the land they had proved together. And he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and the story was not over. It was, in fact, just fully become itself, all the threads drawn in and tied. The claim proved and the family rooted, and the love as solid as the house they had built from good lumber and honest hands. And the prairie wind moved through the apple orchard in the long, good darkness, and everything was exactly as it should be.